Voice log 13.
To Farrah Wallace of Greenhaven Settlement, from within the ruined city. I know you predicted disaster would befall our enterprise, but we have yet to meet it. We are safely within the ruined city. I can see the facility spires clearly. Although they look near, it will be several solar cycles before we reach them. I've begun dreaming of the facility again, and I think I have learned why, Farrah. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to start with what happened today. It was an odd thing, but full of meaning. As we traveled deeper into the ruined city, we encountered someone else making their way through the quiet streets. He was clearly in a very bad way, so we invited him to share our fire. He was famished, and we watched with morbid amusement as he devoured the rations we set in front of him. His eyes looked haunted, and he would often stare off into the encroaching darkness expectantly, as if waiting for someone or something to suddenly step into the light. The food and warmth seemed to bring him back to himself, and we began a conversation. But when the poor fellow learned of our destination and my obsession with it, the haunted look returned to his eyes. The stranger explained that he had been to the facility before. Eager to glean more insight into my destination, I asked the stranger to tell me about his experience. I've recorded his story and added it to this voice log. Please, I know you tire of Spire Talk, Farrah, but you must listen on and learn what it is that haunts this stranger, and what it is that haunts me as well.
My story may sound like madness, but I implore you to reserve your judgment until the tale is told. I must start at the beginning, and for most of us left in this world, the beginning of life as we know it now is the collapse. The flash of light, the quake, the screams, it is seared into the minds of all the survivors. Yet I remember the day I met Mari even more clearly. Sifting through the rubble for scrap, we instead found and clung to each other. Companionship brought a sense of stability to our shattered reality. It gave us a deeper purpose. We weren't trying to survive for ourselves anymore. As life regained something akin to a normal rhythm, we realized we'd pieced together a home. We scavenged together, always. Twin survival machines. We soon found that small communities were blossoming like flowers from the rubble. Understandably, these places were first united by a mutual sorrow for our lost world. Eventually, though, they were brought even closer by a fierce curiosity to know what had brought us to our current state of existence. I recognize the same curiosity in you, young one. Writhing beneath your skin, isn't it? Mari and I spent many a night sitting next to the fire, staring into the flames, theorizing together about what caused the collapse. I knew we'd never have a satisfying answer, but when I held her, nothing else mattered. We would always see the massive twin-spired structure on the horizon, and we recognized it from before. No one remembers what it was once called, but it's believed to be ground zero for whatever caused the collapse. It was also rumored to be haunted or full of hostile remnants of the facility's old defense network. We imagined endless piles of valuable scrap waiting to be claimed within it. Maybe even answers to some of our questions. Once we had discussed the possibility of going inside, it became all we would talk about. Mari was the most eager to go. She said she felt drawn to the spires. I would often find her staring at them as if lost in thought. She spoke of dreams in which she was already there, standing in front of a gate that had no key. She said she felt them, calling to her, This worried me greatly. Yet, when Mari finally decided to make her way there, how could I not follow? When we entered the facility, we quickly discovered that many of the rumors were more than true. All sorts of ghosts and automatons patrolled the hallways of that place. We crept quietly through rooms, avoiding enemies while sifting through the heaps of scrap we had been hoping for. We found all sorts of records, mysterious trinkets, keys, and even old explosives. We quickly filled our packs and I made to leave, but Mari said she had to keep going. She discovered an elevator that led down into the darkness, dimly lit by 4 beacons that cast our faces in an eerie red glow. It was there, in that light in the elevator, that I saw clearly the fever in Mari's eyes. It terrified me. I asked her to return with me to the surface, but she refused. She said she was too close now. As soon as the elevator doors opened, she sprinted to the next room. When I caught up to Mari, she stood near the center of an open room, with her ear against a red stone. It was the centerpiece of an ominous metal structure, its edges seeming to glow with an otherworldly light. Finally, I could feel it too, the draw of this place. But I could also hear a muffled voice speaking from somewhere in a language I couldn't understand. I asked Mari to leave, but she was transfixed. She grabbed a large piece of scrap metal off of the floor and began bashing it madly against the stone. It felt so wrong. I ran to Mari and, with tears streaming down my face, begged her to stop, to return to the surface with me. No scrap or knowledge within the facility could be worth losing what we had. But I was unable to turn her from her task. Suddenly remembering the contents of her bag, Mari reached into it and pulled out one of the old explosives we had found on the floor above. She turned it over in her hands until she found the activator, and before I had time to react, she shoved it into a small crevice above the red stone. The explosion sent us flying backwards. When the dust cleared, I could see that the stone was gone completely. In its stead was what I can only describe as a crack, or rift, hanging in midair at the center of the room. The voice I had heard was no longer muffled. It was painfully loud. As I watched, long, finger-like appendages emerged from the rift and began pushing it open, tearing reality to make its way into our world. I watched in horror as a monstrous creature emerged, towering over Mari and I. Its many legs held open the rift, as if holding a door, and behind it was a seemingly endless void. The creature's dreadful gaze passed over me and settled on Mari. It reached one of its arms towards her, and Mari rose to meet it. She walked right into the creature's outstretched arm, which curled around her like a vine. I ran toward the rift, but the creature had already begun to retreat, lowering itself back into the void like it was a pool of deep, dark water. Within moments, I found myself alone in the room. Mari was gone. It took me the better part of a day to get out of the facility. When the light of the setting sun found me at the entrance, I collapsed onto the ground. My grief was a poisoned blade in my flesh, and I lie weeping until the stars were overhead. This is why I am going back. I am returning to that place to find a way to Mari. If I have to destroy myself to get to her, so be it. But no one should follow me. No one should enter that place. Please pass my warning on to any and all who you meet. Yes, secrets sleep within the facility walls. But that place threatens to destroy the remnant of our world. It is not worth the cost. It is not worth the cost. When you tell my story, please tell them Mari's name. Tell them that I loved her.
It's me again, Farah. You are no doubt horrified by this tale, and maybe a bit vindicated as well. I should be terrified, but I find that I'm not. The emotion I feel is longing. You see, I'm sure, sister, that you have noticed the parallels in Mary's story and my own. Her obsession, her dreams. I have had them too. I know the gate she saw. I hear what I know must be the same voice calling me there, and it is only clearer the closer I get to the spires. Tomorrow, I plan to wake before the others. I will leave these audio logs with a request for them to be delivered to you in Greenhaven and walk onwards toward the facility before anyone can stop me. I must seek the door that was opened, or open one of my own. I must answer this summons, as Mari did, or my soul will not rest. And so it is here I must leave you. Forgive me, sister. I can't resist it. Please know, I carry your memory with me into the dark. Your brother, Rami Wallace.
End of voice log.
What you've just heard is Void Seeker, a little bit of fan fiction from my, well, written entirely by my co-host. And, well, I have a few questions about it, if you don't mind.
Please.
So, I guess to start us off with, like, where did this idea originate? Where did it come from?
I think the idea probably originated. The kernel of the idea started last year, I think, when you and I were talking about things that we find scary in Star of Providence.
Mm-hmm.
And, listeners can go back and listen to that episode. We talked about some different things. But I found that Trespasser is one of the scariest things in the game. Like the concept of it, I think. But I think in a way, a lot of the things that you fight in the game are not as horrifying to the ships
Mm-hmm.
or the pilots themselves because they're the ones fighting it. They're almost used to it in a way. You know what I mean? Like they're on the front lines fighting these things. And so the kernel of this idea was that to kind of display the horror of the facility, it would be more effective if I went to normal people, people that aren't used to delving into the facility.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're coming into it not really knowing what they're getting into.
Hmm. Having re-listened to that episode recently, by the way,
Mhm.
I noted that one of the things that you mentioned, that something that is scary to you in particular, is this idea of like powerlessness in to change your fate. Like the idea that
Mhm.
what is going to happen to you is written and you cannot change it and you are doomed to take that path. Was that something that you had in mind when you were writing this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if anyone picked up on this, probably not, but the story itself is kind of an homage to one of my favorite books, which is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
A classic.
Yes. I originally read this book in high school, and I was really not excited to read it at all. Usually when you get assigned a book, if you're forced to read something, you're usually not very happy about it, right? You want to read, I was reading like Redwall and things like that. But I read it and ended up loving it. And definitely one of the themes of the book is like compulsion and like, feeling the need to do this thing or to complete this thing, um, which, Dr. Frankenstein is compelled to do what he feels like he's able to do with science, even though people are advising against it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like dealing with obsession. But also, once he puts himself on that track, he does, Frankenstein very much loses control. And it does feel like he's like fated to, for some bad things to happen to him. So yeah, I think that there's some overlap uh, in that way with the story of Frankenstein.
Speaking of Frankenstein, I imagine that it being an homage to Frankenstein is part of the reason why it is written in the particular way that it is. It is this kind of flowery, verbose, kind of very deliberate form of writing that calls attention to itself.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a first draft.
I know.
Nick, yeah, yeah, Nick very kindly gave me some feedback on it, and I edited it down. But I mean, I'm a big fan of Dickens, Charles Dickens, and yeah, there's a lot of like, in the past I've been a fan of like very flowery prose, and it's very kind of like an archaic way of writing at this point. But the
Mhm.
reason I wrote it that way was certainly to try and capture the same kind of vibe that you get in Frankenstein, which is, the for anyone that doesn't know, the framing device in Frankenstein is actually this guy who runs into Dr. Frankenstein, and he's writing letters to his sister. So that's like the most direct homage that there is in the piece. But I always found it to be a compelling way to frame the narrative. But it is quite flowery. And Nick, if you'll indulge me, I'll read from letter number 4.
Sure, by all means, go ahead.
I'll read one line of this, but it's letter 4 to Mrs. Seville, England, August 5th. So strange an accident has happened to us that I cannot forbear recording it, although it is very probable that you will see me before these papers can come into your possession. So it's
I mean,
just, yeah, it's a very archaic way of speaking, right?
yeah, but I mean, and this is something that I did mention to you when I was reading what I think technically would have been the second draft,
Mm-hmm.
because this wasn't like the version you sent me like a couple of weeks ago was not even the first version. There
Mm-hmm.
had been long before that yet another version of this that was a proof of concept, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
The topic I mentioned is, the style of writing, and now that you're bringing this up, there is a question of like, is the impact and the delightful horror of the story of Frankenstein, does subject matter,
Mm-hmm.
the way it is written, and or perhaps a combination of both, because there's a lot of different ways one can write horror. And the I know that my inclination when I write is to make the writing is just the means by which I want the reader to envision something. And I
Mm-hmm.
want my words to just be as smooth and frictionless a system for delivering that imaginary experience.
Mm-hmm.
And with a language like this, you kind of get very much stuck on, not stuck on, but you become very aware of like the individual words that make up the story. And I get it. I'm It's just a matter of preference personally, because I find it a little bit. I'm like,
Distracting.
well, at some point I'm going like, uh-huh, yeah, it just feels like it calls attention to itself, and less so what it is actually trying to say, the actual story it is trying to tell,
Mm-hmm.
is my point.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think a lot of people that don't like that kind of prose, like Charles Dickens or or Frankenstein, like they would agree with you. My answer to that, Nick, would just be that I think one of the things I find compelling about Frankenstein is I feel like the way it's delivered, like, kind of amplifies the horror in a way, because there's this contrast between the person that's speaking, and the the way they speak, and the things that they're talking about, because it's very like proper in the way he
Hmm.
recounts it, but he's very properly recounting some terrifying things. So I've liked that angle of it, but I also think that it does communicate of it kind of like a self-important vibe, but I think that fits the character.
Well, that is what your character in the story, it kind of comes across this way in a sense.
Hmm.
Like this idea, like you are encountering something horrifying, even if it's not blatantly, overpoweringly terrifying. There is still this lingering sense of like there is something horrible here, and
Hmm.
by sort of speaking this very deliberate, very not artificial, but constructed manner, you
Hmm.
kind of sense someone is trying to like figure it out and put it into words and just be like, yeah, this is what I'm seeing, and like, but a very scientifically minded approach to something that is ultimately something, not just because it is like the quote unquote magic of Trespasser, but like
Hmm.
something that's very emotional and that doesn't really have an explanation other than just it feels wrong. Or like how, this idea like you're trying to explain this thing and you feel this compulsion, and the compulsion doesn't make sense, but you're still feeling it and you're trying to like untangle this knot. And so I feel like that is a way in which perhaps the language in which it is written can enhance it, but you know, it is a tricky thing to pull off.
Yeah. Well, I think listeners can judge whether I think it'll hit people differently, and I certainly did my best. But it's encouraging to hear you say that like it has a scientific feel to it, because actually in Frankenstein, both of the main characters are scientists,
Hmm.
and their obsession with figuring things out, with getting answers, is basically what leads to their destruction, or the destruction of the lives of the people around them. So I was trying to capture that same vibe of like, you know, the main, not Dr. Frankenstein himself, but the guy who's writing letters to his sister. I forget his name now off the top of my head, but the framing device, right?
Hmm.
He's traveling to the North Pole because he wants to go there for science.
Hmm.
He's studying, and he's so compelled to go that he's like forsaking his family and his like
Hmm.
entire life, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to capture, was that same kind of vibe of like this very analytical scientist who, isn't too worried about the consequences of what they're doing, and is more interested in kind of satisfying this compulsive curiosity that they cannot shake.
It is this notion of like, I shall pursue knowledge at any cost, even if it's tremendous personal cost, and to the point where like it stops being like, for all the justification of like, oh, reason and knowledge and insight, the obsession stops becoming rational. It just
Hmm.
becomes this idea that consumes them entirely and leads to self-destruction, which is, well, in a sense, that is what happened to Mari. you know they
Yes.
they fully give themselves over to this thing, to the point of completely forgoing any sense of self-preservation.
Hmm. Yeah. Yep, exactly. So
Yeah.
that's probably what's going to happen to the main character too. He'll find a
Oh, they're
rift and
all
just
doomed. They're all gonna die.
yes, they are. Anybody going into the facility that's not in a little ship, probably not going to end up too good for
Oh,
them.
most of those die too.
I appreciate you giving me some feedback on the piece. I
Hmm.
appreciate you humoring me, and appreciate the questions.
Hmm. No problem. I hope everyone has had a good Halloween out there.
Yeah, maybe you're like me and you wish you could see a ghost. If you are, then I hope you saw one.
Mm-hmm. And I assume Michael Farr is going to tell you, don't eat the candy corn.
Yes, you know what? We should make that a tradition each year. I should remind people that candy corn is disgusting.
I still haven't eaten candy corn.
You know what? I hope you go your whole life without eating it, my friend.
Yeah, I hope so too at this point.
Oh, well, yeah. Happy Halloween, everyone.
Happy Halloween.